So she gives a rock to us, that's the task. And we give her a piece of cucumber and she eats it. The other one needs to give a rock to us. And that's what she does. And she gets a grape. And she eats it. The other one sees that. She gives a rock to us now, gets again cucumber. She tests the rock now against the wall. She needs to give it to us. And she gets cucumber again.
Many of the courses I teach are in applied ethics, and on a regular basis I teach things like just war theory, and also ethics for engineers and scientists, which is for professional ethics, geared especially at engineers. Now this means that what has value in my work with this background in terms of applying those theories is looking at how the decisions we make have value in terms of ethical value. So when we look at this, the question is, well, how do we decide what the right thing to do is from, again, this sort of ethical standpoint? So it might not be a self-interested standpoint, it might not be what's best for me, but what is a good decision? And this sort of thinking is supposed to apply both to our personal lives and our professional lives. So in my engineers classes, for example, they're not supposed to walk out of there merely thinking about how to be ethical as an engineer, but how to be better people. So that's the idea. Now typically there are three major perspectives from which people make ethical decisions. The first two I'm going to say are not the best ones. The third one is the one that I would recommend. The first one seems to be the default position. This is consequentialism. One famous variant of this is utilitarianism. We think in terms of what has utility. Now in this sort of thinking, what has value are the goals, the ends, the consequences or results of our actions. So we judge our actions based on what comes about. And in this case, an action is good if it has good consequences. It's bad if it has bad consequences. It's fairly easy, fairly straightforward, and I think that may be why it's so attractive to people, especially as a default position. They think this just seems the obvious way to think about things. What comes about? What's the result of my action? Now this means that the methods we use to achieve those goals are then justified by those consequences. In other words, the ends justify the means. And for this kind of a view, what we're evaluating in particular are just the consequences. We don't evaluate the means except insofar as we ask, do those means or methods best achieve that goal? So if we could find a means that would better achieve it, that's the one we should use. More efficient, more effective, maybe more probable at actually achieving that goal. There might be some methods that aren't maybe as guaranteed. Now in this sort of a view, how you're moral is then you figure out what has that consequentialist value, usually an appeal to the greater good, and then you decide what's the best means for achieving it. Again, very straightforward, very good. Now the big drawback to this approach might be, in a sense, an obvious one. The methods we use, the means we use, truly only have instrumental value. They really are only judged in how well we achieve those ends. And what this means is that any means whatsoever can be used, any means, because they're always justified by the end. If you're appealing to the greater good and someone says, well, I don't like the means you use, you need to say, but look at the greater good it brought about. And this means that there's nothing that's intrinsically wrong or inherently wrong on this view. There is no action we cannot take if we can appeal to a greater good. And this means actions that people might think are wrong, like lying or cheating or stealing, aren't wrong if you can justify it. But notice what else this includes. Murder, genocide, those would be okay if they bring about a greater good. So on this sort of a view, there is nothing that's wrong because you're always looking at the consequences. So even things that some of us might say, but that's a wrong action. Some would say, no, it brought about the greater good. And I think people don't like that about this view. They want to say there are certain things you just should not do to other humans. But again, on this view, they seem to be allowed. Another alternative to this is what's called deontological, and this is where we look for moral rules. And these would guide our actions, and this would tell us which actions then are intrinsically good or intrinsically bad. And the consequences here are irrelevant. Don't worry about what the consequences are. Do the right action. And in fact, one famous proponent of this view, Kant, says, let the consequences be what they may. Don't worry yourself about the consequences. Do the right action. So if we have a rule like, do not lie, do not cheat, do not steal, you never do those things, ever. Why? Because they are inherently wrong. They are always wrong. And again, if you say, yes, but if I lied on this occasion, it would bring about a greater good, Kant would say, who cares? It's wrong. You just do not lie. You don't start down the path of doing those behaviors. Now, in this view, what you need to be moral is, first of all, you figure out what the rules are. You use your reason, you think it through, you come up with, say, a universal law imperative. Could this behavior be universalized? Could I allow everyone to do it? And you come up with rules then that are under all conditions and without exception, always right. The second step is to say, I have such respect for this moral rule that I will follow it. And then the third thing is you do your best to act on that choice. In other words, the choice is no good if you don't actually follow through on it. So the third step is maybe the most important one. You do your best to actually live up to that rule. It's not just enough to choose it, but to live up to it. And if you do that, you are what Kant called a person of goodwill. You've figured things out properly, you've willed yourself to do the right thing, and you've done it. And you always follow the rules, and again, you do not judge people based on the consequences of their actions, but just how well they follow the rules. Now, the common criticism of this approach is that there are times where following the rules, again, leads to bad consequences, and so for some people, that is wrong. And we can imagine a scenario where, say, a doctor has to lie to a patient in order to save his life. And we'd say, well, in that case, the doctor is right to lie. He should lie. And yet, on this view, the doctor would be wrong. Say, but he saved his life. Well, too bad. It was the wrong thing to do. He ought not to have done it no matter what he did. He should have found a way to save the life without violating the rules. But for some people, the consequences matter at least somewhat. And in this case, a view that leaves that out is leaving out something fundamental. So I would say the best approach is the combination of these two. And this is virtue ethics. This is a focus on character, being the right kind of person. And on this view, we're working toward morally good ends. We try to figure out what the right things to do are, what the right results are to try to achieve. But we only work toward those ends by using morally good means. In other words, there are some actions that are inherently wrong that you cannot use to achieve those good ends. So this is somewhat limiting and restrictive. You have to figure out what the morally good ends are. You do have to think about the consequences, but you also have to think about how you achieve those consequences. Now, on this view, this applies to both our actions and our feelings. So this is a very robust sort of ethical view as well. We're not just judging the consequences of our actions. We're judging how we feel. And this seems maybe counter to a lot of modern thinking. We tend to think our feelings are authentic and our feelings can't be wrong. And we would tell someone who said, you shouldn't feel that way. Don't tell me how to feel, right? Those are very modern sentiments. But when we think about it, actually we can judge our feelings, and we often actually do judge our own feelings and the feelings of others. On this view, then, what we're looking for, I'll talk about how we do judge those in a second, but on this view, what we're looking for is in terms of performing the right action and having the right feeling, the things to think about in terms of it being right are, is it at the right time? So the timing of our action and our feeling matters. Toward the right people. Are we feeling the right way toward the right people? To the right extent, for the right reason, and in the right way. Again, a very robust thing that's taking into account all the different factors in a decision-making process and trying to come up with the best possible ones for all of these. And again, both for your actions and your feelings. So 5 things to consider about how you act, 5 things to consider how you feel. This is very difficult. It's asking a lot of us. But it's, I think, the best way to do this if we want to make truly good decisions. This would be good for society. As a quick example of the right time and the right people, we could just think of an action like giving to charity. The right time certainly matters, so giving after a natural disaster when people are at their most need might be the right time. Waiting until 6 months later when people aren't in as much need might not be as ethical a time. Or toward the right people, a rich person who gives to his own children isn't as ethical as someone who gives to those who aren't well off, for example. So we can see how these sorts of things would apply. The key is that in terms, especially of the right reason and in the right way, maybe even to the right extent, it's about balance or moderation. What we want to do is see this as a spectrum where at each end of it there's extremes. So you can go too far in your actions or your feelings, and you can not go far enough. So you can be excessive or deficient in terms of how you behave and how you feel. And what we want on this view is to hit the midpoint, the intermediate or a mean. And it's a range between those. So even though it's at the extremes we want to avoid, what we want to try to do is get somewhere in that middle part so that we can truly see that we haven't gone too far, haven't gone far enough, we're avoiding those, but in a sense by allowing it as a range, we're also allowing for different circumstances to come into play, where on different occasions more might be required or less might be required. So we want a range. It can't be an exact midpoint. And as a good view of this, I've got on the screen the spectrum here. The difference between 2 and 10, an arithmetic mean, is 6. It's the same for everyone on all occasions, no matter what the circumstances are. And that would be very strict, very precise, and that's not how ethics works. Human behavior, human circumstances are much more complex than mathematics. So the bottom spectrum captures it better, where there's a range between those two, and again, maybe on some occasions more toward the excess is appropriate, other times more toward the deficiency is appropriate. Now in terms of examples of these, one, I think, good example of acting where we can see this play out, and I'll go back to this so we can see the range there, would be courage. If the building's fire alarms went off right now, one of the things we would need to do is get out of the building. Now, if one of us climbed under one of the chairs, refused to get out, we would say you have a deficiency of confidence, right? Both in terms of how you feel and in terms of how you're acting. You need to be able to get out of the building. That requires confidence, picking your stuff up and walking out of the building. But let's say as we're walking out, we see that there actually is a fire and there are people trapped in a room. Now, we're not fire people, none of us. We're not trained, we don't have equipment. Should any of us run through flames to save other people? Maybe one of us would be tempted to do so, but that would certainly be maybe not just at the high end of that range, but even in excess, because it's beyond what we would expect from people. It's beyond what the expectation would be. We would truly say you've done something heroic and outside the range of what's required. So in other words, those of us who don't run through the flames wouldn't be blamed for failing to do this. We hadn't acted immorally. But let's say as we go outside, firefighters pull up. And we say to them, there really is a fire up there, and there are people trapped in a room. And the firefighters, oh my God, there actually is fire? Well, we're not going to go in there, that's dangerous. And they refuse to go in. Well, they would have then the deficiency. They would be cowards. But notice it, the same action that for us would be more than required, more than what's required, namely running through flames, is what we require of them. So the confidence we require is higher in that range, closer to the excess. They require more confidence because of their training, their equipment. But it's also possible for them to go to excess. Let's say after the fire is still raging, but everybody's safe, one of us says, oh my God, I left my books in the room. And the firefighter says, well, let me go back and run in for your books, and runs through flames to save books. We'd say that's excessive, and certainly not called for. So even somebody with training, even somebody that we might expect more on certain occasions, can go too far. Now in terms of a feeling, maybe the obvious one to judge, the easy one to judge, is anger. Even though we're tempted as moderns to say things like, well, don't judge me for how I feel, or my feelings are mine. Yet when somebody gets angry at the inappropriate times or toward the inappropriate people, we think that's wrong. And it's not just if they do things like, throw chairs at people or actively act angry. It's the feeling of anger. Right? Even when we know that's all that's going on is they feel anger, they're too quick to anger, they get angry at the wrong people for the wrong reasons, we do judge them, and I think it's appropriate to judge them. And on this view, we should extend that to all of our feelings and not just something like anger. Now, admittedly, this view is hard, right? Finding the balance, finding that range of virtue in terms of our feelings and actions is difficult. This is not easy to live up to. This is not something that you can achieve merely by sort of willing yourself to do it. And especially when we put it in terms of character and being the sort of person who can do this on a consistent basis. We're not asking someone to be good one time. We want people to be good all the time. And that sort of consistency over time is very difficult to achieve, and that's where we habituate ourselves to good character. If you want to be a just person, practice doing just actions. If you want to be charitable, practice giving to charity. If you wait until the moment it's most needed, you won't achieve it. It has to be the sort of thing we practice at. But again, it's difficult, especially if we have bad habits, because what you then have to do is break your bad habits and set new ones. And the older we get, the more difficult that is. But that doesn't make it any less ethical to do that. Now, you might say, why should we put in this difficult time and effort? What do I get out of it? Sure, society would be better if we all did this. But on this view, the reward we get if we achieve this balance consistently, if we do have good character, what we call a flourishing or good life, our life overall runs well, is balanced. And that is what we would call happiness. So what better thing to achieve than true happiness? That's it.
So how can us, what can we do to define our personal values? Are there some steps, is there something that we can actually, very easily understand, apply, and, maybe implement to, create that final value that our employers can see? Now, values in marketing, they are hierarchical, if you want, to put it like that. So we have, higher order values like life goals, right? Which are enduring beliefs about, what we want to stand up for, what is it that defines us as human beings and as professionals. And we don't actually have a lot of those. Those are smaller in numbers. We talk about dozens. I want to be a good person. I want to be ethical. I want to be reliable. Okay. But we have a limited set of those values, and they actually drive what we're going to follow next. Also, we have domain-specific value, which is a lower order, if you want, not necessarily less valuable, of course, but it's a lower order type of value in which we decide that, hey, as a consumer or as a human being, I want to be associated with companies that are green, companies that stand up for something, companies that help people in distress, companies that are environmentally conscious, right? They don't necessarily, and of course, in terms of numbers and in terms of view that we may have about this, those are higher, right, in terms of numbers. So, of course, we're going to select, right, the ones that really are worth our investment. And then we have, as consumers, product-specific values, such as, well, if I'm going to buy a car, I want this car to be, an electrical car. Or maybe, a car that is, green, very environmentally conscious. Again, so my value, if I want to be doing good for the society, will reflect into the company that I choose to put my money in and the products of that company that best reflects what I believe in. So how can we create this brand, or how can we move ahead with this? The secret is in the fact that values provide motivation. So if we have them, actually we're going to be compelled to act upon them. We are going to feel a dissonance if we feel and believe in a certain way and don't act in that particular manner. So how can we do that? One very interesting topic in marketing, which is actually getting a lot of traction, pretty much all over. If you just do a Google search on personal branding or human brands, you'll see that, the numbers are, really, really big. People are interested into standing out. How do I make sure that I make a name for myself in whatever it is that I'm doing? And on this note, this consistency that you were talking about into our, way of behaving in a certain, manner all the time definitely helps building that foundation of a personal brand. But at the same time, a very interesting question is, should we always be consistent, or should we actually do something a little bit out of our mid-range? Because how can we stand out if we're always in the middle, if we're always, right, very similar to everybody around us? So talking about a human brand, it's an object, just as in marketing, a product, a can of soda, right? It is the object of marketing communication. It's something that we communicate to people about. You know, what's the price, what's the form, what's the distribution. It's the same thing with people, right? So yeah, everybody keeping up with the Kardashians. You guys probably are all, aware of those. But what are they? What are we talking about, right? Those are brands. Those are human brands. Whatever it is that they call them money-making machines, right? Whatever it is that, comes out from that family, right? It has a certain value for a certain number of followers, right? So they were able to do that. They were able to build a particular brand, and not necessarily on something that it's very tangible many times, right? So this intangibility, maybe we can build it on our own personal values. Maybe you keep up with your favorite musician. Maybe they're not as famous as the Kardashians. Okay, but maybe you're keeping up with someone who's not well known, maybe an unknown person, but in your own a circle of people that you're talking to on a regular basis, you'd be able to define someone who is always reliable, someone who's always ethical, someone that you can always go back and ask for help in a certain situation. So just because it's not well known, from a celebrity point of view, that doesn't mean that particular brand is not valuable, which is something that I think we should all. And I always tell my students, just because you're not on TV all the time, that doesn't mean your brand is not valuable. It is, the value is driven by what's actually, being perceived by everybody else. So what I actually do in my classes, I help them build their personal brand. So we go through a semester-long project in which they apply the principles of marketing into building this personal brand. And it has 3 big stages, if you want. First is, identify your values. See what actually makes you who you are. And those values that should define a person are at the intersection of what gives you meaning, what gives you pleasure, and what are your strengths. So what I ask them is, of course, go and ask yourself, have a little bit of introspection. And I found out that it's one of the most difficult things that I can ask my students. They're like, but I don't know about me. Well, go think about it. It's okay. It is difficult. Some people, take a lifetime and still don't know exactly who they are. And they still, can't tell whether that particular value is 100% theirs. But I do encourage them to say, what is, what gives you meaning? What inspires you? What excites you? Okay? Helping people. I had students saying, what? At the end of this project, I realized that I would rather work for $0, okay, as long as I can help people. And that was extremely inspiring to me. I was very happy, to find out that we are motivated by so many other things than just, final value of money. What gives you pleasure? That's also something interesting. Talking about happiness, right? We do follow that. It's something that it's screaming inside us, right? We need to find pleasure in our life. If we can't find the pleasure, we cannot give pleasure, to people that are around us. So I think that's another important part that should define our personal brand. Also, this, if you want, builds towards the authenticity of our brand. If we kind of hide away the fact that, wait, I take pleasure in teaching, I take pleasure in doing research, I take pleasure in talking to people, right? I may not be authentic. And as long as we are straightforward with what we like, right, we can build a better brand. Of course, what are our strengths? What are we naturally good at? Should be built into this foundation of, personal branding, because again, it builds into that authenticity. This is truly who I am. This is what I can do. This is what I like. And this is, how I can help some other people. So at the intersection of all this, the sweet spots should be those global values, right, that define a person. And again, applying the principles of marketing, now, once we identify what is it about us that is unique and really applies to us, what I ask my students to do is do a little bit of marketing research. Now that you find out that your product, right, the one that you want to communicate about, it is being reliable, being trustworthy, and being on time, for example, okay, well, how about you go out there, do a little bit of research, and see if actually people perceive your brand in this particular manner. Many times we do feel about ourselves that we are reliable, but when we ask somebody else, we may be shocked about the answers that we have. And you go to your mom and say, well, Mom, I thought that you can always count on me. And your mom would say, well, sometimes yes, sometimes no, right? So, this marketing research, really means getting input from people around you, whether they're friends and family, they're going to have a certain view of you. And supervisors or professors, they're going to have a different view. Obviously, they see another dimension, right, that completes that particular brand. Classmates and colleagues, again, another dimension to that particular, human brand. And again, at the intersection of all these different views and all these dimensions, right, that really shape your personal brand, should be truly what defines you, whether we like it or not, and whether we are aware of it or not. That is one finding that, over the course of many years, my students use the words, I was shocked to find out about me. I was excited to find out about me. I had no idea that people perceive me in that way. And again, it's a very difficult exercise to ask yourself who you are and then ask somebody to give their opinion, about who you are. The outcome of this particular phase of doing this marketing research, if you want, on your brand, should be a brand statement. Just like we have, in a product marketing, our brand is, to help humanity organize their documents, okay, like Xerox is doing, okay. But we can have this kind of a statement about our personal brand. I want to be a reliable professional who is extremely good at keeping up with the newest innovation in this domain. That can be a really good brand statement if you want. Because, right, and we have to substantiate this type of personal branding because I have these skills, I have these strengths, right, that we identified in the beginning that it really defines that person. So that should be easier, right, for us, or it should make it easier for us to have that 1 minute or 2 minute elevator speech to any employer that we may find. So who are you? Tell me about you. Well, this is what you should be telling about them. And you can be very confident that's true. You can be very confident that it reflects you. And you cannot fail on something that is authentic and really, true. And then, of course, the final phase is how do we actually transform this into a value? How do we make people aware that this brand statement that defines me, these values that drive me, are actually of value to you? One easy way is to really compare yourself with your target job. Get a job description, I think, yeah, that's how they call it, right? And, read it out and see what the requirements are and compare, okay, I can do this, identify the gaps, right, for future development, because no brand is, of course, set, right? So it takes us a lifetime to actually build it up to something that is, really powerful. And again, that comparison should allow the employers to really see the value in you compared to other candidates, right? Someone comes in and it's less defined, right? Sometimes maybe you don't have necessarily the skills, but skills can always be improved upon, right? But it's going to be very difficult to make a person who really doesn't believe in being reliable or honest, right, become more reliable and honest. That would involve a little bit more coercion, right? And that actually costs money. So from an institutional point of view, we want to spend as less money, right, as possible on employees. So, at the end of it, again, we started with what is a value that defines me, and then we should be able to identify a value for the employee. What is it that I bring to your company that should actually, move it forward? So hopefully, right, as human beings, as students, as professors, as um, uh, anything you want, employees, we should be able to come full circle from what defines us as value and bring value to society. Thank you. Yeah.
But I thought it was pretty interesting, both in sort of the research going up into this, as well as what we've heard today, the huge difference sort of in the takes on what value-based decision-making is and how it can affect you, the applications of it. And what I thought was sort of interesting going into today was this idea of value-based decision-making sort of goes hand in hand with goals, right? It's how do you want to achieve these goals that you've laid out? And you can't do one without the other. You have to determine what your end goals are, but how is it that you want to accomplish those? So again, being a graduate student, my take probably a little bit different, but one of the best pieces of advice that I got when I started, I'm in my 5th year, was treat graduate school as though you're going up for tenure, right? So a tenure track position for most faculty, you're primarily, I don't want to say graded, but evaluated on three main pillars of publication and research, teaching and evaluations, and then service and outreach. And so I've sort of made that my goal of I am going to build my entire graduate career around these 3 things. So a lot of my decisions that I've made in the last 5 years are, how does this help me? How does this fit into this as though I were going to create I've seen those books that you guys have to put together for your tenure track evaluations. They're giant, they're huge. So if I were to do that, what would this complement that? But that doesn't go into the value-based portion of that, right? That's my end goal. And so along the way, I've been confronted with a number of things where I've had to decide, what kind of researcher do I want to be? Do I want to be an ethical researcher? Do I want to sacrifice this potential friendship that I have because I know there was a mistake that was covered up during a research process? Or I happen to be in a department where I have the luxury, I say luxury, other people don't say so, of teaching. So I get the opportunity to actually be a course instructor. And do I want just the good evaluations because I'm a nice pushover teacher, or would I like my evaluations to reflect that I push my students, right? And that when, again, confronted with an ethical dilemma, I have a student that's plagiarized, do I want to risk that, tainting or marring my nice record, right? So just those sort of basic things. So along the way, I've sort of had to decide, for my end goals of building these 3 different pillars, who do I want to be? What are my values that I'm going to implement to accomplish these? And something that I thought was interesting, which sort of kind of a take on, is this idea of your personal brand with the brand of the institution that you're with, right? And we get into this idea that things should always match, and they don't always match, and that's sort of the beauty of it. They don't have to be identical, but if your values can at least complement the value of whether you're in a research institution or some other form of academia, or in the corporate world, or again, if you're the Kardashians building your brand, how does it fit into that, right? Do they complement each other? So, for example, 2 wholly separate end goals is UNLV as an institution has a plan to become a Tier 1 research institute. Now, as somebody who's a researcher and as somebody who is extraordinarily vested in UNLV, I am an alumni on multiple levels. I transferred here and graduated with my bachelor's degree here. I earned my master's here, and now I'm working on my doctorate. I would like nothing more than to see UNLV become a Tier 1 research institute. But again, that's an end goal, that's an outcome. So how is it that they're going to get there? So our institutional leaders have laid out a plan of different ways that they're going to go there. Well, as a personal goal, I guess one could say, is a value that I put a lot of focus on is inclusion and diversity, promoting diversity. So when it comes to research, I think that the more diverse your electorate, your body is, then you're going to have a better or rich tapestry of ideas, ways to approach problems. So as a researcher, I highly value that idea of inclusion and diversity. UNLV, I think just this year, somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, ranked second in the nation in the most diverse campus, and I think that's for the student body mostly. And I'd like to see that same diversity reflected in the researchers, in our faculty, in the professors, in the staff. That we have gender equality, we have racial equality amongst all these different positions, that we have the inclusion of the LGBT community. So for a lot of what I do in my outreach is how do I promote that? How do I promote this LGBT inclusion into these different faculties? How can I, as a male, promote gender equality, racial equality? So for me, that's a huge value that drives myself, and whether I can't speak for UNLV, whether that's a value of theirs, but I know they promote it. They're proud of their diversity. So I can see that even though my end outcome is probably different than UNLV's, I want to complement that. So again, sort of going on that line, my lab, myself, we attend a neuroscience conference every year. It's the largest of its kind. Nearly 30,000 neuroscientists convene on a conference, which is crazy. I mean, that's a lot of nerdy people in one place at once. And they have ancillary or satellite events, and they are to promote diversity. You have them for countries, you have them, there's an Albanian, so it's to promote and highlight the research contributions of researchers that come from Albania. There's one for Australia. There's a lot that promotes gender equality, moving women up through the ranks of science and neuroscience in general. And so a couple years ago I noted that we lacked that for again, going back to the LGBT community, we lacked that. So about 3 years ago, we started a LGBT social where we could have researchers from that community come highlight their contributions, allow a platform for these individuals to network, collaborate with each other. But more importantly, and I think in line with the values of UNLV, is to sort of promote that UNLV is an inclusive and respects this particular community, right? And that helps get the name out there for UNLV, that the hosts of this worldwide LGBT neuroscience social is specifically geared for that, to promote that diversity. And in the end, if somebody is faced with that decision of all right, I'm going to accept a tenure track position here or here, what are my values, and they see that UNLV has reached out to this community, that's a positive thing that's going to help bring diversity to our research institution. So again, outcomes, goals may be slightly different, or they may be similar, but as long as the values sort of complement each other. And I think that's really important as you develop your own personal brand, but try to meld that with the brand you're with, right? So we all in this room, we all have our own individual brands, but we are part of a larger brand that is UNLV. So how do we complement, how do we fit into the brand that is UNLV? So that's sort of driven a lot of what I've done as a graduate student, and I have to thank the person that gave me that advice 5 years ago, because I'd probably still just be sitting, I don't know, I would not be as active as I am, both in the community doing outreach as well as in my own personal, being the best researcher that I can be. So again, slightly different take, a little bit more experience-based of what I'm talking about today, but the idea is the same, sort of figuring out what it is that your brand is, what are your values, and how to move forward with that and fitting it into the bigger scope of things. And I think it's ultimately important to remember that your values and your goals can't be separate. They go hand in hand, and you have to figure out what the outcome is and what is the means to get there. Can you justify how your actions are? But really diverse topic, really interesting topic, this value-based decision making. A lot of applications for it. So that's all I have.
Thank you.